10 years ago, my mother Joan looked me dead in the eyes on my 14th birthday and said I was a waste of space. Her boyfriend Kurt threw a moldy cupcake at me while they laughed about finally getting rid of the dead weight. They packed my stuff in garbage bags, changed the locks, and left my younger brother Zane and me on the street while they went on a cruise with Kurt's son, using my dead father's insurance money. I spent those 10 years building something, working 2 jobs through high school, getting scholarships, clawing my way through college and into a career that pays more than Joan ever made. Every decision I made was with one goal: never being powerless again. Last Tuesday, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Joan's voice came through desperate and shaking. She and Kurt got evicted last month. Kurt's construction business failed. They burned through their savings and now they're living in Kurt's beat-up truck. She said they were sorry for everything and needed help with first month's rent somewhere. I listened to the whole thing without saying a word. Joan kept talking, explaining how Kurt's back problems meant he couldn't work, how they'd been applying everywhere but no one would hire them, how they just needed a little help to get back on their feet. She said Zane gave her my number and told her I was doing well now. The thing is, I've been waiting for this call for years. Not hoping for it exactly, but I knew it would come eventually. Joan always made terrible decisions with money and worse decisions with men. Kurt spent the insurance money on his truck modifications and that cruise, then never saved a dime afterward. I could have predicted this exact situation 5 years ago. When Joan finally stopped talking, I asked her why she thought I would help her after what she did to me. She got defensive immediately, saying she was young and didn't know how to handle things after my father died. That Kurt convinced her we'd be better off with relatives anyway. That she never stopped loving us but had to make impossible choices. I told her those relatives she mentioned, they refused to take us in. Zane and I spent 3 months bouncing between foster homes before our uncle finally agreed to let us stay in his basement. We slept on air mattresses for 2 years, while Joan was posting photos from restaurants and concerts on Facebook. Joan started crying then, saying she made mistakes, but she was still my mother. That family should help family. She said Kurt was a different person now, that he felt terrible about how he treated us kids back then. I asked her what exactly she wanted from me. She said they needed about $2,000 for first month last month and deposit on a small apartment, maybe help with groceries for a few weeks until they got jobs. She promised they would pay me back as soon as they got on their feet. Here's what Joan doesn't know. I've been successful enough to buy a house in the same neighborhood where she used to live. 3 bedrooms, nice yard, the kind of place she always said she wanted when I was growing up. I drive past her old apartment building sometimes just because I can. I could write her a check for $2,000 right now and not miss it. I could solve her immediate problem without thinking twice about the money. But Joan also doesn't know that Zane and I talk every week. He told me about Kurt showing up at his work last month asking for money. How Kurt got angry when Zane said no, called him ungrateful after everything they did for us kids. Zane works at an auto shop making decent money, but he's got his own bills and a girlfriend he's planning to propose to. When I asked Joan if Kurt was there with her, she said yes. I asked to talk to him. Kurt got on the phone and immediately started with this speech about how he was sorry for being hard on me when I was younger, but that's just how men in his generation showed love. He said he was proud of how I turned out, and that maybe his tough approach actually helped make me successful. I asked Kurt if he remembered throwing that cupcake at my face. He was quiet for a long time, then said he didn't really remember details from back then, but if he did something like that, he was sorry. He said, "We were all under a lot of stress after my father died." That's when I knew nothing had actually changed with either of them. Joan still makes excuses for Kurt's behavior. Kurt still acts like his cruelty was somehow justified or helpful. They're both still the same people who threw children out of their home, just older and desperate now. I told them I needed time to think about their situation. Joan immediately got hopeful, saying she knew I was a good person who would help family. Kurt got back on the phone and said he always knew I was smart enough to do the right thing. The call ended with Joan saying she'd check back with me in a few days. She said they were staying at a motel for now, but couldn't afford it much longer. Kurt added that they really appreciated me considering helping them out. I've been thinking about this call for 3 days now. Part of me wants to help just to end their suffering. But a bigger part of me remembers being 14 years old watching them pack my clothes in trash bags while they planned their vacation with my father's money. Joan calls it making impossible choices, but she chose Kurt over her own children. She chose a cruise over making sure we had a home. She chose to change the locks instead of figuring out how to make things work. Now she's calling it family, helping family. But where was family when Zane and I needed help? I know exactly what I'm going to tell them when Joan calls back. Update 1. Thanks for all the support on my first post. Some of you asked what I told Joan when she called back. Well, buckle up because this got messy fast. Joan called Friday morning around 7. I was getting ready for work and almost didn't answer, but I'd been thinking about what I wanted to say for days. She immediately launched into this hopeful tone, asking if I'd decided to help them with the apartment deposit. I told her no. Not just no to the money, but no to having any relationship with her or Kurt going forward. Joan went silent for about 10 seconds, then started talking really fast about how she understood I was hurt, but that holding grudges wasn't healthy, that she'd made mistakes. But she was still my mother, and Kurt was sorry for how things happened back then. I interrupted her and said I wanted to be very clear about something. What happened wasn't a mistake or poor judgment during a difficult time. She chose to prioritize her relationship with a man who treated her children badly. She chose to use my father's insurance money for luxury instead of securing our housing. She chose to change the locks instead of finding a way to make things work. Joan tried to argue that she was grieving and overwhelmed, that Kurt convinced her we'd be better off with family who could provide stability. I asked her which family she meant since our relatives refused to take us in. She got quiet again. Then I told her about the past 10 years, how Zane and I lived in our uncle's basement on air mattresses while she posted photos from concerts and restaurants, how we both worked through high school to help with groceries, how I took out loans for college while she was buying Kurt a new motorcycle. Joan started crying and said she didn't know we were struggling, that she thought we were happy with our uncle. I asked her when she'd ever called to check on us or ask how we were doing. She said Kurt thought it was better to give us space to adjust. That's when I realized Kurt was probably listening to the whole conversation. I asked if he was there, and Joan admitted he was right next to her. I asked to speak to him directly. Kurt got on the phone with this fake friendly voice saying he was glad we were finally talking this through like adults. He said he knew there were hard feelings, but family should stick together during tough times. I told Kurt I remembered exactly what he said to me that last day, that dogs eat better than I deserved, that I was dead weight they were finally getting rid of. I asked him if he remembered saying those things to a 14-year-old kid on his birthday. Kurt's tone changed completely. He said I was twisting things around and making it sound worse than it was, that he was trying to teach me about real life and responsibility, that maybe if I'd been more respectful and helpful around the house, things would have gone differently. I asked Kurt why a child should have to earn basic housing and food from the adults responsible for him. Kurt said kids today are too soft and that his generation understood you had to work for what you got, that coddling children doesn't prepare them for the real world. Joan took the phone back and begged me to forget about the past and focus on helping them now. She said they were desperate and had nowhere else to turn, that I was successful and $2,000 wouldn't even impact my life, but it would save theirs. I told Joan that's exactly the point. $2,000 is nothing to me now. But 10 years ago, having adults who cared about our well-being would have meant everything. She chose Kurt over us then, and now she wants me to choose her over my own peace of mind. Joan got angry for the first time in the conversation. She said I was being cruel and vindictive, that I was punishing her for things that happened when I was just a kid and couldn't understand the whole situation. She said I was successful now, so obviously everything worked out fine. I told her everything didn't work out fine, that Zane still has anxiety about being abandoned, that I spent years in therapy learning to trust people, that we both struggle with feeling worthy of love because the people who were supposed to protect us threw us away instead. Kurt grabbed the phone back and his voice was completely different now, cold and mean, like I remembered from when I was younger. He called me an ungrateful little punk who couldn't appreciate everything they'd done for me, said I should be thanking them for making me tough instead of crying about ancient history. He said they'd fed me and put a roof over my head for years, and now when they needed help, I was acting like a spoiled brat. That maybe he was right about me being worthless all along if this was how I treated family in need. I stayed calm and told Kurt he'd just proved my point perfectly. This was exactly who he really was underneath the fake apologies. Joan had called me family when she wanted money, but Kurt just called me worthless again when he didn't get what he wanted. I told them both I was done with the conversation and hung up. But here's where it gets complicated. Tuesday evening, Zane called me upset. Apparently, Joan had called him crying, saying I'd been cruel and refused to help them when they were facing homelessness. She told Zane that I was successful enough to help but chose not to because I wanted revenge. Joan asked Zane to talk to me about reconsidering. She said Kurt was having health problems and they just needed a little help to get back on their feet. She promised they'd pay back every penny once Kurt was feeling better and could work again. Zane was torn because he felt bad about their situation but also understood why I didn't want to help them. He asked if there was any way I might change my mind, maybe help them find a cheaper place or cover just part of the deposit. I explained to Zane exactly what Joan and Kurt had said to me on the phone, how Kurt went right back to calling me worthless the moment he got angry, how Joan made excuses for his behavior just like she always did. Zane admitted he wasn't entirely surprised. He said when Kurt came to his work asking for money, Kurt had gotten nasty when Zane explained he couldn't afford to help. Kurt had called him selfish and said we both owed them for raising us. but Zane was still worried about them being homeless. He's got a good heart, and the idea of anyone sleeping in their car bothers him, even people who treated us badly. I told Zane that Joan and Kurt being homeless was the natural consequence of their own choices. Kurt spent years buying expensive tools and motorcycle parts instead of saving money. Joan enabled his spending and never held him accountable. They chose to live paycheck to paycheck for a decade instead of planning ahead. Yesterday, Zane called again. Joan had contacted him twice more, asking if he'd talked to me yet. She was getting more desperate and started hinting that maybe I owed them money anyway since they'd supported me for years when I was younger. Kurt had apparently told Joan that I was probably making good money and could easily afford to help multiple family members. He thought I was being stingy and holding a grudge over nothing. Zane asked me what I wanted him to tell Joan if she called again. I told him to be honest that I wasn't changing my mind and that I'd asked him not to be their messenger anymore. But now I'm wondering if Joan and Kurt are going to escalate this somehow. Kurt's already shown he gets nasty when he doesn't get his way. Joan has started hinting that I owe them money for raising me, which sounds like she might be building up to some kind of demand. I've worked too hard to build my life to let them drag me back into their drama, but I also don't want them harassing Zane or trying to manipulate him into feeling guilty about their situation. Anyone dealt with family members who try to use other relatives as go-betweens when you've set boundaries? I'm starting to think this is just the beginning of their pressure campaign. Update 2. You guys, this situation has gotten completely out of hand. Remember how I was worried Joan and Kurt might escalate their pressure campaign? Well, they definitely did. Monday afternoon, I was in a meeting when our receptionist knocked on the conference room door. She looked uncomfortable and said there was a woman in the lobby claiming to be my mother who needed to speak with me urgently about a family emergency. I excused myself and went to the lobby, and there was Joan sitting in one of our client chairs looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was messy, and she had this desperate look that made everyone in the office stare. Joan stood up when she saw me and started talking loudly about how she'd been trying to reach me, but I wasn't returning her calls. She said she was sorry to come to my work, but this was an emergency and she needed to talk to me right away. I told Joan she needed to leave immediately, that this was my workplace and she had no right to show up here. Joan started crying and said she wouldn't leave until I agreed to help her and Kurt find housing. The receptionist was watching this whole thing, along with two coworkers who happened to be walking through the lobby. Joan was making a scene, and it was exactly the kind of thing that could damage my professional reputation. I told Joan we could talk outside for 5 minutes, but then she had to leave and never come to my office again. Joan followed me out to the parking lot still crying and talking about how desperate they were. She said they'd been staying in different motels but were running out of money fast, that Kurt's back was getting worse sleeping in the truck, and he could barely walk some days. She begged me to reconsider helping them with an apartment deposit. I asked Joan how she'd found my workplace. She admitted she'd looked up my company online and driven around until she found the building. I asked her how she'd gotten to my office since I knew she didn't have a car anymore. Joan said Kurt had dropped her off and was waiting in the parking lot across the street. I looked over and saw Kurt's truck parked there with him sitting in the driver's seat watching us. I told Joan this was exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that proved I was right not to help them. That showing up at my job to pressure me in front of my coworkers was completely inappropriate. Joan got angry and said she was fighting for her survival and I was acting like her asking for basic help was some kind of attack. She said any normal person would help their mother in this situation. I told Joan that normal mothers don't throw their children out at 14 and normal mothers don't show up at their kids' workplace to make demands. She said I was never going to let go of what happened when I was younger and that I was using it as an excuse to be heartless. Joan started getting louder and more emotional, saying she'd made mistakes. But she was still my mother and I owed her something after she raised me for 14 years. That she'd fed me and clothed me and taken care of me when I was sick. I reminded Joan that taking care of your children's basic needs isn't something they owe you for later. That's what parents are supposed to do. Joan said I was being ungrateful and that she could have given me up for adoption after my father died, but chose to keep me instead. At that point, I told Joan our conversation was over and she needed to leave. She started following me back toward the building, saying she wasn't done talking yet. I had to tell her very firmly to stay away from me and my workplace or I would call security. Joan finally got back in the truck with Kurt, but not before yelling that I was abandoning my homeless mother and that my father would be ashamed of me. Tuesday morning, my boss asked to speak with me privately. Apparently, Kurt had called our main office number Monday evening, asking to speak with my supervisor about a personal matter regarding me. Kurt had told the person who answered that he was my stepfather and there was a family emergency involving my mother's health. He said I wasn't responding to calls and he needed my boss to give me a message about coming home immediately. The person who took the call had gotten confused and transferred Kurt to my boss's voicemail. Kurt had left a long rambling message about how I was refusing to help my sick mother and that my boss should know what kind of person they had working for them. My boss was professional about it, but clearly concerned about having family drama spilling into the workplace. He asked if there was anything the company needed to know about my situation at home. I explained the basic situation without going into too much detail. That my mother and her boyfriend had kicked me out as a teenager, that I hadn't spoken to them in years, and that they were now asking for money I wasn't comfortable providing. My boss was understanding, but advised me to handle the situation quickly and keep it away from the office. He said clients had noticed the commotion in the lobby, and it wasn't the professional image the company wanted to maintain. I felt humiliated that Joan and Kurt's desperation was now affecting my career. These were the same people who'd told me I was worthless and would never amount to anything, and now their behavior was threatening the professional reputation I'd worked years to build. Wednesday evening, Zane called upset again. Joan had apparently been calling our relatives telling them I was refusing to help her when she was homeless and potentially dying on the streets. She'd called our uncle, who let us stay with him, crying about how successful I'd become, and how I was letting pride and old grudges prevent me from saving her life. Our uncle had called Zane asking what was really going on. Zane had to explain the whole situation to our uncle, including what Joan and Kurt had actually done to us when we were kids. Our uncle was shocked because Joan had apparently told him years ago that we'd chosen to leave and live with him instead of staying with her. Joan had also contacted my father's sister, my Aunt Rose, with the same story. Aunt Rose had barely spoken to Joan since my father's funeral because she blamed Joan for moving on too quickly with Kurt. But Joan was desperate enough to call her anyway. Aunt Rose had told Joan she didn't have money to help with housing, but said she was disappointed in me for not taking care of my mother. Zane had to call Aunt Rose and explain what had actually happened when we were teenagers. The worst part was that Joan had somehow gotten my current phone number and started leaving voicemails, not just asking for help anymore, but accusing me of being selfish and cruel. She said I was punishing her for things that happened years ago and that I was choosing money over family. In one voicemail, Joan said she understood why I was angry, but that holding grudges was poisoning my soul and hurting me more than it was hurting her. She said forgiveness would set me free and allow me to be the good person my father raised me to be. In another message, Joan said she knew I was a good person deep down because my father had been a good man, and that she was praying I would find it in my heart to help her before it was too late. Kurt left messages too. His were different, more aggressive and demanding. He said I thought I was better than them, now that I had money, but that family was supposed to stick together no matter what. Kurt said he'd always known I was selfish, and that this situation was proving he was right about my character. He said Joan was too good to see it, but that I was showing my true colors by letting my mother be homeless. The most infuriating thing was how they kept calling themselves my family and talking about family loyalty when they were the ones who broke that family apart in the first place. I started documenting all the calls and messages in case I needed to get a restraining order. Joan and Kurt were clearly not going to respect boundaries and were escalating their pressure campaign. But here's what really got to me. In her latest voicemail, Joan said she'd been talking to people about my situation, and everyone was shocked that I would let my mother be homeless when I had the means to help her. She said she wasn't trying to embarrass me, but that people had a right to know what kind of person I really was. That my success didn't mean anything if I didn't use it to take care of family. It was clear Joan and Kurt were now trying to damage my reputation in our community as another way to pressure me into giving them money. They were turning this into a public campaign about what a terrible son I was. I realized they weren't just desperate anymore. They were angry that I had power in this situation and they didn't. And they were trying to find ways to hurt me if I wouldn't comply with their demands. This wasn't going to stop with a few phone calls. Joan and Kurt were prepared to make this as difficult and embarrassing for me as possible until I gave in. Time to change tactics. Final update. After Joan and Kurt started their public campaign to shame me into helping them, I decided it was time to end this on my terms. I'd been patient long enough. Saturday morning, I drove to the area where Zane had told me they were staying. There's a rough part of town with several cheap motels that rent by the week, and I figured they had to be at one of those. I found Kurt's truck at the third place I checked, parked behind a rundown motel that advertised weekly rates. The truck looked worse than when I'd seen it in my office parking lot. Rust spots, dented panels, and the back window was cracked. I knocked on the door of the room closest to where the truck was parked. Joan answered, looking shocked to see me. She was wearing clothes I remembered from when I was younger, faded and worn out, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. Joan immediately started talking about how glad she was that I'd come to see them, that she knew I was a good person and that I'd realized they needed help. She stepped aside to let me into the room. The motel room was exactly what you'd expect. 2 double beds with stained bedspreads, a small table and chairs that had seen better days, and the smell of cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. Kurt was sitting on one of the beds and looked surprised but pleased to see me. Kurt stood up and started talking about how he was happy I'd come around and that this showed real maturity on my part. He said he always knew I was smart enough to do the right thing. Eventually, I told them both to sit down because I had something to say and I wanted them to listen without interrupting. Joan sat on the edge of one bed looking hopeful. Kurt sat back down, but I could tell he was already getting defensive. I started by telling them exactly what I'd accomplished since they threw me out 10 years ago. How I'd worked 2 jobs through high school and graduated with honors. How I'd earned scholarships and graduated from college debt-free. How I'd built a career that paid more in a month than Kurt probably made in 3 months when he was working. Joan tried to interrupt to say she was proud of me, but I told her I wasn't finished talking. I told them about the house I'd bought in their old neighborhood, about the reliable car I drove, and the savings account that could cover their rent demand without me even noticing the money was gone. I wanted them to understand exactly what they were asking for and exactly what I was capable of giving. Then I told them why I would never help them. I looked directly at Kurt and reminded him of every cruel thing he'd said to me that last day. How he'd called me worthless dead weight that deserved less than dogs. How he'd laughed while they packed my clothes in garbage bags. Kurt tried to claim he didn't remember saying those things, but I cut him off. I told him I remembered every word because it was the day I learned what kind of man he really was. Underneath his fake apologies, I turned to Joan and reminded her how she'd chosen Kurt over her own children, how she'd stood there and watched him treat us badly without defending us once, how she'd used my father's insurance money for luxury while her children slept on air mattresses in a basement. Joan started crying and saying she was young and didn't know how to handle everything after my father died. I told her she was 28 years old when she threw me out, not some confused teenager. I told Joan that she'd had 10 years to reach out and apologize, 10 years to check on how Zane and I were doing or whether we needed anything. Instead, she'd posted pictures of concerts and vacations while we worked through high school to help pay for groceries. Kurt got angry and said I was being dramatic and holding grudges over things that happened when I was just a kid. He said they'd done their best in a difficult situation and that I should be grateful for everything they'd provided for 14 years. I told Kurt that providing food and shelter for your children isn't something they should be grateful for later. That's the bare minimum responsibility of being a parent. And Joan had failed at even that minimal standard. Kurt stood up and started talking about how ungrateful and selfish I was, how they were facing homelessness, and I was choosing to punish them instead of helping family in need. That's when I told them both the real reason I'd come there. I explained that I'd been documenting all their harassment of me and my brother, the calls to my workplace, the visits to my office, the voicemails demanding money, and their attempts to turn our relatives against me. I told them I'd already spoken to a lawyer about getting a restraining order if they didn't stop contacting me, that showing up at my workplace and calling my boss had crossed a legal line that could affect my career. Joan looked confused and said she was just trying to reach me because I wasn't returning her calls. She said she was desperate and didn't know what else to do. I told Joan that being desperate didn't give her the right to harass me at work or try to damage my professional reputation, that her problems were consequences of choices she and Kurt had made, not emergencies I was responsible for solving. Kurt got really angry then and started yelling about how I thought I was better than them now that I had money. He said I was acting like some kind of big shot when I was still just the same worthless kid they'd raised. I stayed calm and told Kurt he'd just proved my point perfectly. Even now, when he was asking for my help, he couldn't stop himself from calling me worthless. Some things never change. I told them both that they would never contact me again. Not through phone calls, not through relatives, not by showing up at my workplace. If they violated this boundary, I would file for a restraining order and they would face legal consequences. Joan started begging me to reconsider, saying they had nowhere else to turn, that she was sorry for everything that had happened, but she was still my mother and she needed my help. I told Joan she'd given up the right to call herself my mother when she chose Kurt over her children, that real mothers don't abandon their kids and then demand gratitude for it later. Kurt tried one last manipulation tactic. He said that my father would be ashamed of me for letting my mother be homeless when I had the means to help her. I told Kurt that my father had worked 2 jobs to provide for his family and had left insurance money to make sure we'd be taken care of if something happened to him. My father would be ashamed that Joan had wasted that money on a man who treated his children badly. I told them both that I was done with this conversation and that I was leaving. If they tried to contact me or Zane again, or if they showed up at my workplace, I would file legal papers immediately. Joan followed me to the door, still crying and begging me to change my mind. She said she'd made mistakes, but she loved me, and that family should forgive each other. I turned back one last time and told Joan that love isn't just a word you say when you need something. Love is actions, and her actions had shown me exactly how she felt about her children. Kurt came to the door and yelled that I was making a mistake and that I'd regret treating family this way. He said people would see what kind of person I really was. I got in my car and drove away while they were both still standing in the doorway of that motel room. It's been 2 weeks since then, and they haven't contacted me at all. Zane said Joan called him once, asking if I'd said anything about changing my mind. But when he told her no, she didn't push it. I think they finally understood that I'm not the powerless 14-year-old they threw away. I have resources, legal options, and boundaries they can't cross without consequences. The best part is the peace I feel now. For 10 years, I've been carrying anger about what they did to me, but standing in that motel room looking at their failed life, I realized they'd already faced the consequences of their choices. Joan chose Kurt over her children and ended up with a man who can't provide for her. Kurt chose to spend money on toys instead of saving for the future and ended up broke when his body gave out. They created their own situation through years of bad decisions. I built the life I wanted through hard work and good choices. They built the life they deserved through selfishness and short-term thinking. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be the solution to problems people created for themselves. Joan called me worthless and threw me away, but I became successful anyway. Now she's the one who needs help, and I'm the one with the power to say no. That 14-year-old boy they abandoned grew up to be everything they said he'd never become. And now they have to live with the knowledge that they threw away the one person who might have helped them. I'm done carrying their guilt and anger. They can carry it themselves.